All right, so it should be recording now. Yeah. So we do have two presenters today, and actually really quick. All right, so we have two presenters today. Really excited to have them. I'm going to introduce them one at a time. I'll introduce. They'll kind of do a presentation, and then I'll introduce the next person who will come up. So our first guest today is Nico Quijano. He is the Homelessness Outreach Program Manager for the City of Bellevue, with prior professional experience as an elementary school teacher and as an outreach worker, case manager, and director at a nonprofit serving teens and young adults experiencing homelessness. Nico is originally from New York City, married into the Pacific Northwest, I like that, has an adorable 2-year-old, plays guitar, the 2-year-old doesn't play the guitar, runs marathons, enjoys a good pizza, and loves to engage the public. So I'm going to hand it over to Nico. And I'm going to start sharing my screen, probably important, so they can see the presentation that Nico's going to do. All right, hopefully you all can see that. Welcome.
Awesome. Can I come up there? Should I stay here?
Come up here.
Okay, great. Yeah, will do. All right, hey, there's my face. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to join the conversation today. I'm here to talk about homelessness in the city of Bellevue as a means of thinking about polarization and how to break through it. I just had a lovely introduction, so I don't have to introduce myself, which is great. We can save a couple seconds and go straight into talking about what we are going to talk about today. There we go. So I'm going to start by talking about the sort of what I've used the sort of two core differing perspectives on how people think about homelessness, and how one might characterize those two perspectives. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about where I find myself in relation to those perspectives. The short version being that I find myself of both minds depending on the circumstance and depending on the specific situation. I'll talk about also how that sort of plays out for me professionally. And then I'll talk about how that plays out in the city of Bellevue and some of the things that I try to do to navigate what can be a polarizing topic in an effort to make it not so polarizing. So let's just jump right in. That first perspective or priority that folks might think of when regarding homelessness is a perspective around community health and safety, which really centers sort of law enforcement, or making sure that the response to homelessness is centered around making sure that homelessness doesn't become something that is interruptive to or dangerous to the overall community. That prioritizing the community has to come first when it comes to responding to homelessness. So that can include policies such as not allowing public camping, trying to prevent homelessness from becoming something that is disruptive or interruptive to the community, or otherwise taking efforts to make sure that everyone in the community is safe and well, perhaps even sometimes at the to the detriment of a person who's experiencing homelessness. And that failing to do so, failing to intervene in some way to stop a public encampment or to engage with someone who is experiencing homelessness in some sort of visible disruptive way, creates an unnecessary public health and safety risk. That there's a sort of obligation for us as a community to maintain and manage the safety and well-being of the community. Now, some people who are of this mindset may also believe that it's okay to engage in supportive services as a sort of accompaniment to prioritizing public safety, that as long as we're making sure that people are safe, why not also offer them services and try to offer them every opportunity? And there are some folks who may be of the mindset that offering services is something that's enabling a misuse of taxpayer funds, ultimately ineffective or just a misuse of communities' time and energy. Now, where I stand in position to this is that certainly there are things about this positionality that I'm receptive to, that I can understand. This picture is a picture of an encampment, right? And certainly when encampments get out of control, they can look like this over the course of a block or a neighborhood or stretches of hundreds of feet or miles, right? It can get very out of control very quickly. And certainly nobody wants that, right? Nobody wants a community that is covered in trash or littered, or where there are people who are feeling unsafe in their community. I've also found, as someone who has worked one-on-one with a number of people experiencing homelessness and attempted to help them find stability and structure and the support that they need, that structure, that consistency, and that, yes, even consequences are really important to helping someone to find their pathway to stability. That frankly, it is behaviorally appropriate for a person to engage in behaviors that we might find objectionable as a survival strategy, that having been turned away by systems, having been abused and taken advantage of, one will necessarily develop survival techniques that help that person to survive in such a system in a way that can be really dangerous for other people in their community. And finally, as someone who's worked with with folks experiencing homelessness quite a lot, I've seen circumstances where without some guidance or without some structure, homelessness circumstance can really sort of blow up or get out of control without the sort of supportive case managers, without some sort of guidelines or structure. An encampment could go from 1 tent to 2 to 4 to 5. Someone who's experiencing homelessness does not receive the support they need, and they can decompensate and end up in severe mental health crisis and really be in need of really severe emergency assistance at that point. So I look at all those things over the course of my career, and I certainly recognize why someone might say, well, we have to make sure that the community is safe. We have to make sure that we prioritize policing. We can't let people get away with things that that the rest of the community isn't allowed to get away with. I can understand and sympathize with that. The sort of potentially differing perspective, the other priority would be advocacy, advocating for the rights of those who are experiencing homelessness, sort of recognizing that in order to help people who are experiencing homelessness, supports need to be created and offered that meet the scale of the problem, and that thus far they have not been. That the services and supports that are needed for a community or person experiencing homelessness just widely have not been created. And that in fact, historically, marginalized populations, people who have been have been historically oppressed, have been never put in the position to thrive or succeed in the way that they need to. And so there's a systemic obligation to focus our energy and our efforts on reorienting our systems to better serving the population of folks who have not had the support that they need to find stable housing and to get the support that they need. And that in fact, as long as we're creating laws that are punitive, that engage in preventing people from being able to be homeless in public, that we're in fact punishing people for not having enough. And we're punishing them by taking away even more from them. And so thus it's unfair and ultimately ineffective. And certainly there are studies that support that. Of course, where I stand in position to this as someone who has been an advocate for those experiencing homelessness is that I've seen a lot of this to be very true, and that it is absolutely essential that we build out more systems and really focus on supporting people. What I've seen is that ultimately homelessness starts with some sort of demographic vulnerability. Like I said, parts of the community that have been historically oppressed or victimized or taken advantage of, whether it's because of race, gender, people who are experiencing mental health difficulties, people who are in poverty or otherwise destitute, become vulnerable to homelessness. And when they become homeless, when those people do become homeless, there's not systemic response that is adequate to provide them the support that they need. Now, some people who take this position of homelessness advocacy may say any sort of like punitive action is not acceptable and should not be undertaken. And some say, yes, as a community, we do have to keep people safe. As a community, we absolutely have to intervene when something is leading to a circumstance that is detracting from the health of the overall community. But we can only do that if we're also offering services or trying to take some sort of intervention. And other folks will say, under no circumstance should we be arresting anyone. Under no circumstance should we be engaging in any sort of law enforcement for a group of people who have already been systemically oppressed over the course of their lives. That we should be focusing on offering them opportunities and helping to craft systems that support them in the needs that they have. And like I said, I've seen that over the course of my career that we do have to be able to offer services to these individuals. So I sit in both of these camps. Having worked with folks experiencing homelessness, I've seen why it's important to have structure, to think about community health and safety, and I've seen why we have to build better systems and really focus on the needs of the individuals who are experiencing crises and not currently housed. Um, so in addition to holding that role personally, I'm a city employee whose job it is to be a homelessness advocate and to do outreach work to folks who are literally experiencing homelessness. While at the same time, I work within city government to help enforce, to help with law enforcement and to help with other city staff who work on upholding the rule of law as it is established. And so even just my position can sometimes run counter to itself as I sort of navigate these complex issues myself. I'm not elected. I'm a hired employee, and I'm hired to represent and work for all residents of the city of Bellevue. That means people who are experiencing homelessness who live in the city of Bellevue. That means people who may just want us to get that person off the street corner, out of that encampment, so that our community doesn't turn into a cesspool like that other city. And that includes people who prioritize, no, we have to make sure that this poor person who's on the street corner gets the support that they need and receives the services that they were never offered. And we have to recognize systemic oppression that they've been subjected to and try to account for that and help them to receive the services that they really need. My role then becomes to craft programs and response that meet those competing priorities, which can seem like they're at odds with each other. The opportunity that I have in doing this for the city of Bellevue is that I think there's some things that are unique, and there's some things that kind of apply more broadly to our community. The city of Bellevue especially takes pride in, and some of you may roll your eyes, in sort of having this sort of entrepreneurial spirit, right? Of sort of like, oh, there's a challenge or there's a difficulty, we'll roll up our sleeves and we'll figure something out because we're sort of captains of industry and we've had all these successes. We can figure something out if only we sort of work hard and use our innovative mindset and are creative and apply the right resources. Because of that mindset, certainly we have a community that has centered itself around sort of being a tech hub and being fairly well-to-do, being fairly clean. But there's also a priority around, like, there are people experiencing homelessness. Cool, let's figure something out. Let's try something new. Let's do something innovative. And so there are opportunities like what is happening in the city of Bellevue right now to launch a new men's shelter that offers 100 beds to men experiencing homelessness, to launch a safe parking program for people who are living in their vehicles, to provide all these array of supports to people that other cities may be slow to do. And so that's a major opportunity. Furthermore, there's a lot of overlap between opposing ends, not just, I think, in homelessness, not just in the city of Bellevue, but I think really importantly, broadly, when we think of potentially polarized topics. So when we sort of coalesce into our tribes, what happens is we kind of end up in this sort of like monolithic point of view, right? Where there's a sort of opposition to whom we are opposed. But anytime that we sort of break down the components of the beliefs that position holds, or even just the individuals composed of that group, we can see that there's actually a fair amount of overlap. And I think that's really important to sort of recognize as we deal with polarization to the degree that we want to. So there's an opportunity for us to sort of recognize where there's overlap. To give a very specific example, when I talked about sort of rule of law versus like offering services to people, I talked about how people who might prioritize advocacy really focus on, okay, let's make sure that we offer services. But maybe after we've offered services, yes, it's important for us to also uphold the rule of law. That when all other options have been exhausted, then yeah, of course we have to have laws and we have to make sure that people follow sort of community norms and we can cooperate together. On the other side, someone who is prioritizing health and community of this health of the community might say, yes, I understand that you want to offer services, but we have to uphold the rule of law first. So we have to make sure that people are safe. There's some very clear overlap between those two points of view. And if we were just to break it down into the headlines, I believe in community safety versus I believe in homelessness advocacy, it may not seem like there's that overlap, but as we explore and as we listen to sort of the unique positions of individuals, we can see that there's overlap there. And I specifically, as a homelessness outreach program manager, stationed within the city, I'm a neutral party. So I have the opportunity to sort of navigate those differences and work between the difference and try and find where there is overlap and create programs that meet that overlap. The city of Bellevue is in a lot of ways a city that tries to split the difference between these sort of, in various ways, different ideologies. In the specific instance of homelessness, there are strict laws on encampments. Public camping is not allowed in the city of Bellevue, and they have a protocol that they use to enforce the prohibition of public camping. One is not allowed to park on the side of a street for more than 24 hours at a time without being ticketed, which is specifically targeted at people who are vehicle residents. At the same time, as I mentioned above, there's this sort of spirit of there are people sleeping in their cars. Let's offer them services. Let's figure out something new for them. There are people sleeping on the streets. We can create a shelter program, and we can work on a solution. So there's this chance, specifically in a community like this, to try and bridge those differences and ultimately account for the priorities of both parties. So when I'm trying to do this, I try to think about ways to engage with both parties and try to work towards continuing bridging of those two gaps. And it's a picture of a bridge in the background. You see what I did there. So one thing that I try to do is I try to use the language of the supposedly opposing position. So for example, someone who is opposed to homelessness advocacy or prioritizing the needs of those experiencing homelessness, for whom community health and safety is a priority, they may be opposed because they don't want to bring additional crime to the area. They don't want to expose people in the community to some of the problems that may occur in homelessness. But if you can talk about a homeless shelter in their language of sort of making sure that you're giving people a designated space where they can receive the support that they need, and that actually contributes to community safety by sort of like taking them out of unintentional spaces in the community and putting them in intentional spaces, then that can appeal to them. If you talk to them about how you're creating a program that helps to hold clients accountable, that helps to set them up with structure and success and get them on the pathway to being a productive member of society, those are all the things that people who may be opposed to homelessness services can find appealing because it speaks their language. Similarly, I help support encampment cleanups, which is something that a homeless advocate would oftentimes be very opposed to. But if one thing that homeless advocacy really tries to center is trauma-informed care, recognizing that people who have been exposed and taken advantage of by systems will have endured any number of traumas that may inform the way that they conduct themselves. Because of that, you can talk about an encampment cleanup. It's something that can be trauma-informed. You can recognize it's someone who has been through trauma, who has mental health difficulties, who's going through chemical dependency difficulties, because of the trauma they've endured, are behaviorally appropriately engaging in behavioral choices that are not to their benefit. And so unless someone were to step in and take some sort of intervention or drive them in a direction other than the easiest or most natural choice for them, they'll continue to engage in dangerous or disruptive behavior. And so you can recharacterize some of the interventions which may feel opposed to homelessness as focused on really centering the actual experience of that person and putting them in a place where they can actually thrive or succeed, as opposed to just doing what they've learned to do in order to survive. Now, regardless, I'm going to end up in positions where I do something or where I support a program that is not accepted in the community by at least some community members. I have to remember that any criticism I receive is not personal. It's not directed at me. It's directed at frustration about the system. I have to recognize criticism not as something that is oppositional, but as an opportunity to learn and hear what issues are still taking place and what I need to address. And finally, when that's happening, if I can sort of remove the personal from it, then I can focus on trying to listen without persuading or arguing. Right? My instinct when someone calls and they're angry about a policy or a system or something in place that is detrimental to their community, what will often happen is I'll instinctively want to sort of defend myself or argue with them. If I can stop doing that, if I can stop trying to change that person's mind, instead just hear what they're frustrated about and use that to inform decision making in the future, then it can actually be beneficial to the program that I'm trying to do or what I'm trying to do as a homelessness advocate. If necessary, if someone's looking for a solution or looking to understand why I did something that they don't like, of course I'll take time to try and explain myself, but that's just trying to lay out the basic facts. I'm not trying to persuade them. I'm just trying to be who I am and be authentic to them and let them know what they are, why we got to the point where we're at, in the hopes that we can at some point get to a solution. I found that when someone recognizes that you're arguing with them or trying to persuade them, that's when they put up the wall and stop wanting to listen or collaborate. When you're being authentic, when you're instead of trying to sort of manipulate them, but instead understand them and just let them know where you're coming from, that's where you have a real opportunity to sort of like bridge a gap. None of this is easy, right? This is not easy. But I think people who are engaging in this kind of conversation or thinking about it, I think we have made a choice to do things that are not easy, right? I think one of the things in reading and doing a lot of research in homelessness literature and sort of thinking about homelessness and policy writ large, one of the things that keeps coming up is like, if it were easy, someone would have already done it, right? we're doing things that are difficult because we want to be. So really, we need to be able to revel in conflict, because conflict can be difficult. It can be really uncomfortable, but it can also be transformative. And when we're able to engage in conflict in a way that helps us to move a conversation forward and really think about all perspectives, then we can build a system that will serve everyone, regardless of what the perspective may be. So with that, I will wrap it up, and I'm ready to hand it back over to Stefan. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Online audience, please applaud. All right. So thank you so much, Nico. What we're going to end up doing after Miriam's presentation is I have a couple of questions that I'm going to ask the two of them to respond to as well, and then we can get to your questions. But again, please feel free to put your questions in the chat if you have them. Yeah, so I am pleased to introduce Miriam Oommen. Miriam Oommen, she, they, is a queer Malayali American climate justice organizer, musician, and public speaker. Born and raised in the Pacific Northwest, so not married into it. They are notably a plaintiff on the federal climate change lawsuit Juliana versus US, as well as on the board of directors of the activist defense law nonprofit, the Civil Liberties Defense Center. A multi-instrumentalist and music teacher who was a lot of fun to listen to earlier today. Miriam is a songwriter, fiddler, and vocalist in the queer punk old-time string band Foraging and the Rattling Bones. And if you want to listen to more of that, go to the website. I've already put the link in there. We have the link to Foraging and the Rattling Bones in there as well. Anyway, Miriam co-hosts a weekly Old Time Jam in Eugene, Oregon, facilitates direct action training, and speaks on the intersection between music and social justice. Welcome.
Oh, I wonder if we could find my presentation.
Oh, let me do that. Yes. You don't want to keep talking about this. All right, let's go to.
There we go.
Do you have any video or anything in it?
I do have a few, but it's all hyper. It's like,
okay,
it's embedded. So it
then we're gonna do that.
share sound. Yes. Awesome. Cool. All right. Okay, I can't see myself now, but that's probably okay. You can see me, right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, thanks for that introduction. I'm gonna be focusing, well, there's a lot of desperate aspects to the work I do. I'm gonna be focusing on our lawsuit because I think in this context of like having hard conversations, I think we've had a couple of breakthroughs over the last 7 years now. So a little background, the Juliana versus US lawsuit, 21 youth plaintiffs. I'm not a youth anymore, but when we filed it, I was. And we filed a lawsuit against the federal government claiming that they are making decisions that are exacerbating climate change, and they have a responsibility, a constitutional responsibility to protect and manage a healthy and sustainable climate for their citizens, i.e. us. It's more complicated than that, but we've kind of gone through the news cycle. Like we kind of blew up in the news like 3 or 4 years ago, and now it's been stalled in the court. So we haven't had a direct sort of legal implication to the lawsuit yet, but the social implications I think are honestly even more interesting. So that's what I'm going to kind of dig into. Because in the context that we filed the lawsuit, climate change, and arguably still, but I would say to a lesser degree now, but at that time it was incredibly polarized politically, where it was like if you were conservative, you didn't even believe that climate change was a problem. And if you were liberal or progressive, it was like higher on your list of priorities. At that time, even for, I saw a status or like at that time, even for like Democrats and liberals, it was like not as big of a concern as it was for, I would say, younger people. But anyway, so in that politicized context, with an issue that's not essentially, like, there's nothing that makes it essentially a Republican versus Democrat issue whatsoever, but it had become such. And so in order to address that issue without getting sucked into that polarization, we kind of took a few foundational questions that society and the media have been grappling with and reframed them. And so that's what I'm going to talk about. How do I go to the, oh, here we go. Okay. So I'm going to play a little clip from this video to start.
A warning endorsed by a uniquely broad consensus of scientists in their report to the United Nations at the end of 1990. And the result has been a marked and accelerating increase in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. In California, solar heat has been successfully harnessed to provide electricity on a commercial scale. So has the power of wind.
That what we're doing is not rational, but just simply fashionable. We're talking about doing stuff that makes us feel good rather than stuff that actually does good.
All right. Enough of that. Yeah, so there's a little bit of background that I think is more common knowledge now, but at the time, like a couple years ago, nobody knew about this, that these oil companies discovered that climate change was going to be an issue because they have like geologists and like scientists like working for them. And there was even campaigns early on that kind of were environmentalists. And then what happened is they actually, Shell in particular and Exxon as well, fired their scientists and hired new scientists to like muddy the waters after they even put out this promotion that was like, we should deal with this issue. And then somebody, obviously when we're talking about Shell, we're not talking about one person, we're talking about hundreds of people with differing opinions, and somewhere along that chain of command, it got turned. So if you're interested in that kind of history of the politics of climate change, Drilled is a podcast that really goes into depth on there and focuses on a lot of the research that our legal team brought up in getting in discovery for our lawsuit. Drilled also used some of that research in their reporting. And so anyway, so that kind of foundation, when I was giving talks about our lawsuit and about climate change, I started out by talking about the greenhouse effect and about like kind of the science behind it. And at a certain point, I realized that wasn't really interesting. Like people actually agree. Like that wasn't really as divisive of a subject, like is climate change real, as the media made it out to be. Like if you watch the news, it seemed like there was two sides, like the people who don't believe and the people who do believe. But in reality, it was the vast majority of people believed in climate change. There was just a few select people who were promoting this sort of like anti-environmentalist, or I would say anti-human agenda. And so that's a very complicated political situation. So what we kind of did about it, oh yeah, here we go. Yeah, so here was in 2015 when we filed the lawsuit. Here's like the priorities. You see people who voted Democrat were like 54%, but still like not a huge concern. Independents less, and the Republicans quite low, like not really concerned at all, despite these and now we know the history of like these the media agenda by particular special interest groups that it kind of shaped this political landscape. But at the bottom line, the majority of Americans didn't even see climate change as a serious threat worth investing political energy in dealing with compared to other political issues. So we reframed that question, is climate change real? Because that felt irrelevant, because actually everyone knows climate change is real, and the few people who don't are not even people that we're dealing with or working with. So we reframed that question to be, who is climate change harming? And so that's where we filed our lawsuit under this pretext that we were going to humanize climate change as like being like, okay, this is not a question about obscure science. This is like climate change is having direct, specific effects on specific people for various reasons, for both like racial and gender and identity reasons, as well as like younger generations will deal disproportionately with the effects. And so we made this claim that at the time was quite novel, that youth should be treated as a protected class, like women and like people of color and Black and Indigenous folks have been before in the political system of protected class. As you probably know, is a group of people that you can identify that their marginalization has something to do with their identity. And so we established that youth was an identity that's being disproportionately impacted by climate change, which, as now in this context, like youth climate activists, the term you've all heard, you know about Greta Thunberg, you know about these other sort of people who have risen in that context. But at the time, that was not really a thing that people were doing or thinking about. And youth climate activist was like not a popular term whatsoever. But the common ground, whether you're independent or Republican or Democrat, is that people want their children to be successful, and they want like safe and healthy environment for children. So that was the first question we kind of switched, like from, is climate change happening to like, okay, under the assumption that it is happening, because that is the current science, then what are the implications of climate change? Who is it harming? The other question that there was the other main question that I would say we reframed, I'm going to show a little clip here as well.
What's the best thing we can do to protect the environment? Teach kids to care for it. Paul Weick at DuPont is helping kids to think environmentally.
And by the year 2000, we're going to have only about 3,200 landfills all around the United States to put our garbage. So as we're increasing our garbage, we're decreasing the places that we can put our garbage safely. So that's a very big problem for you and I. And we're using up our resources far, far too much today. How many of you are collecting bottles and containers at home? Oh, that's great. I think we should give ourselves a big hand. How about you?
Paul Weick is doing his part. How about you? We all can do a lot more than we think to prevent pollution. Start today.
So there's a little clip so DuPont is a chemical corporation. And so recycling, and I talked about this in my earlier presentation as well, recycling actually started out as a ad campaign by fossil fuel companies who were concerned that environmentalism would eclipse the financial benefits of plastic for their corporations. And so they started encouraging people to recycle and called it environmentalism and promoted this whole thing. And nowadays, we still think of that way. Like we think of recycling as an environmentalist thing to do, and it's not, but it also kind of eclipses the larger scope of the issue, is the people making the disposable plastic product who don't need to do that. They're just doing that because they can make more money off it. And the whole idea of recycling kind of like eclipse this larger structural climate change conversation. Anyway, so I'll make this simple. The second question we reframed are attempting to reframe is, who is responsible for climate change? And so with things like recycling and things like personal change, the answer is us. If like that's the answer to that question they're answering in this ad, they're showing the children and they're like it seems really positive, but what they're saying is you are responsible for climate change. If you do this thing, then climate change will be solved. And now we know that it's just blatantly not true. If DuPont stopped making disposable plastic products, that might do something. But us attempting to recycle their plastic products is not going to do anything at all. So again, we have another question that was promoted in the mass media. Who is responsible for climate change? It's you. A question based on false pretense. So instead of reframing this question, we continue to ask the question, we just answered it differently. And what we said is that actually it's corporations that are responsible for creating this system. Well, the corporations are promoting the system, but the responsibility of regulating and structuring the system actually falls on the government. So we said it's the government's responsibility to regulate corporations. And so that was the basis of our lawsuit, is that we're suing the government saying that climate change is not our fault. It's not necessarily your fault either, but you have a legal responsibility to not be perpetuating it. And so that was kind of the, I would say, philosophical basis for our lawsuit, is reframing these two big questions and change, and in that sense, trying to pull this issue out of the bipartisan politics and put it more in a context where we can talk about it based on facts and based on science and based on solutions. And so our solution to the lawsuit is a comprehensive plan to restructure our economy. The implications are so complex that while we've had some successes in the courts, we've primarily been stalled. And so the case is not thrown out, but it also isn't, we haven't even gone to trial yet. So, but the implications of these narrative shifts, I think, are pretty interesting. And I think we can already see in the media and in the environmental movement, I think we can see the effects of these changed narratives. Yeah, there you go. Need to do that. Oh yeah, I had a couple other things, but yeah, there we go.
Awesome. Thank you. Pause. If you wanna sit there,
yes.
I'll stop sharing. So I'm gonna pose a couple of questions to our panelists, and it's kind of set up a little weird in that you both are in the corner, and then there's this vast stretch of panorama here, but and of course there's a lot looking at me because the eye is looking at me. Yeah, it's a little weird. So I am hold on. Oh no, that's weird. Give me a moment. Let me see if I can pin. Oh, let me see if I can pin. I don't know if I pinned for myself or anyway. I'm going to ask some questions, and we're going to have both of our panelists respond. And then again, for the rest of you, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. And then do stick around, because we actually have, depending on what we get to, we're going to have some scenarios for you all to think through. Okay, so here's the first question. Please tell us a story about a challenging conversation you had, perhaps when you didn't handle it as well as you wanted to, as well as you wished you had. What happened? What did you learn from it?
I think it was my idea to ask this question. So so I think, and I wanted to ask this because I think sometimes where I've struggled with communicating with others has been the most instructive for me. As you can imagine, there is a lot of objection to folks to serving folks who are experiencing homelessness. One of the circumstances that I end up managing relatively often, or did in my previous role, was sort of working with people on neighboring properties and trying to assuage their concerns or address objections that they might have to the services that we're providing, especially because they might be interruptive to their home life or to their business or whatever else might be going on. One of the first times that I did that as a manager of a drop-in center for folks who are experiencing homelessness, it was in working with a neighboring business that had people sort of breaking into the property and sleeping on their property or defacing their fence or those sorts of things. What I tried to do was focus on in engaging with them and trying to persuade them that they shouldn't be upset, which I think was the first mistake that I made. Was sort of talk to them about like what we prioritize as an agency and tell them why we do the things we do and why our program exists and why the people participating in our program might be behaving in a way. And the reception to that was like, that's cool that you want to help, but I've got a business. I have a business and I'm trying to conduct my business. And so by sort of taking my position and focusing on like why I'm doing what I'm doing or why I have a different viewpoint, I sort of closed off their ability to sort of like advocate or speak for themselves. And they'd send me an angry email. I called them to try and have a communication. And instead of trying to take the time to understand them or hear them, and in so doing, perhaps work to a solution, I tried to emphasize sort of like the importance of what I was doing. And so the sort of like core lesson that I learned there was around just sort of like centering myself or like making myself too important in the story and not sort of taking the time to listen or prioritize and hear what really is motivating a person and then trying to respond. If I had taken the time to ask what they were concerned about, they might have told me, well, like, here's, we're angry because people are breaking through our fence. And so I could have done any number of things. I said, okay, well, here's what I'll do. I'll do like set up rules on our drop-in center so that like if someone violates a property on a neighboring adjacent property, then like they'll also be exited from our property. Or we can like set up a sort of there were any number of things that I could have come up with. But instead of asking them what they're worried about and seeing what they want me to do, I focus on myself. And so I learned that is not effective in trying to build a bridge to another party.
Yeah, I think in my work, again, part of what I said before about the first question that we reframed, like, is climate change real? The amount of people I've talked to who don't believe in climate change is so minimal. A lot of the hard we thought we were going to go into having, we didn't have. That doesn't mean we didn't have hard conversations, though. It just, they ended up being different than we expected. And I think one of them was actually talking to, in particular, other environmentalists who thought that our lawsuit was too broad, like not specific enough, like not maybe just not specifically legally like going to be ineffective. Like they were like their legal claims are like what they call it a creative lawsuit, which I guess in the legal world is generally a bad thing unless it works, and then it's like a legendary thing. but creative lawsuit. So I've talked to, because growing up in Eugene, Oregon, like my community was a lot of environmental lawyers and environmental nonprofits. So it's kind of I have a theory that that's secretly the biggest industry in Eugene. But so getting that question of like, what is, like, why are you doing this? Because it's not going to work, was like a hard, and oftentimes, especially when I was younger, I would respond by saying just like, well, we're just throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks. And I feel like that's kind of a surface level analysis. Like, yes, we can try to do whatever, but if it's not part of a longer term campaign strategy, like, it's probably not going to work. Like, as we've seen with politics, like you kind of have to think in advance. So I think how I would respond now to that conversation is that we kind of, even if this lawsuit doesn't work, we have to, in order to prove that the system is failing us, we have to attempt to ask it what we like. If we never ask, the government for what we need, if we never establish exactly what we want them to do in a best case scenario, then we can't really critique them for not doing it. So in a sense, this lawsuit was really an attempt to just be like, okay, bottom line, like, what if, like, what if the executive branch of the government was like able to kind of like focus in on this issue outside of the political scope and just look at the science and look at what's best for the future, that's a best case scenario that obviously is not the reality, but like at least somebody's got to try. Somebody's got to try that.
Awesome, thank you. Second question. What is a technique or a tool or a tactic that you have found effective in bridging divides?
Yeah. This thing I keep mentioning, but with climate change in particular as an issue, is humanizing. And I think probably also with houselessness is probably also a thing, but like, especially with climate change where it's been so focused on like science and like debate and theory and like these large scale things, like connecting these like issues to like specific experiences, like climate refugees are like a big thing. Like I have family in South India, and there was some big storms a couple of years ago, and like they were like some of my like aunties were like hosting climate refugees in their house, you know, because there are other parts of Kerala had been flooded out. And so it's like those kind of real experiences that a lot of us on the lawsuit, a lot of us have direct personal experiences of climate change and like what like the specific sort of like impacts are going to be and are currently being on particularly marginalized groups, but eventually everybody. And so I think like narrowing down rather than like hitting those talking points that get sort of perpetuated in the media for better or for worse, like kind of like narrowing the focus to be like, no, this is what's happening. This is the problem. No matter what your politics are, if you were in this situation, you would be concerned.
I think humanizing is really valuable. And I think it's something that I also try to do. And I don't want to encourage on your point too much, but you know, like both in terms of like for someone who might be opposed to providing services to people experiencing homelessness, that same person, after they volunteer and learn the individual story of a person, start to see the value in the services that are provided. And at the same time, someone who might be a strong homelessness advocate might think of like sort of business or private residences, like not in my backyard kind of people, or people who are very self-centered, until you sort of recontextualize that individual person's experience as, you know, like this is just a person with a kid who comes home every day and is like cleaning up the needles off of their sidewalk, or like, you know, had someone accost them and like physically assault them. And if you can, again, sort of like take what might on the surface seem like an objectionable point of view and humanize it, then it can help you to sort of recognize why someone might have that opposing point of view. The other thing that I found to be really helpful is trying to like be creative in sort of like your language and your approach to engaging with people. One of the things that I sort of thought as a child, as a young person, was that like trying on sort of different personalities or talking in different ways was sort of like phony or pretentious, right? And the older I've gotten, the more that I've realized that it's actually just maturity, that it's this ability to be able to navigate different worlds and really try different things out and be creative and be artistic even. So when you engage with someone for whom business is the priority, your safety is priority, using their language and really sort of trying to put yourself in their mindset and talk to them in the way that they are comfortable with being spoken to is really important to being able to engage with them. And similarly, if someone is coming from an activist mindset or an advocacy mindset, really trying to think about like why they have put themselves in that position of sort of like trying to advocate for change and use their language of like of combating oppression and intervening in corrupt or unfair systems, and really sort of centering yourself and who that person is and trying to meet them on their level, I think is really important to getting to a place of like successfully engaging with someone. And as long as it's something that you're doing to try and connect with that person and understand them and help to achieve a better outcome for all parties involved, it's not phony or pretentious. It's just something that you have to do to be a citizen of the community. It's someone that you have to be culturally competent and aware and responsive to the various needs and priorities that exist in our communities.
Those are great answers. Thank you. This last little question might be connected to what you were saying. What is a piece of advice that you'd give to our audience for engaging, or how they would engage in challenging conversations about complex issues? So what is one thing you might suggest that they should do?
Well, one thing that I would recommend is, and I think I've spoken to this a little bit, so I won't belabor the point, but finding a way to actually understand sort of whatever the two sides of the argument are, in whatever way it is, sort of embodying that both positions. Whether or not you ultimately agree more with one or the other, sort of getting to the root cause of what would cause someone to believe what they do, so that you can at least start from a position of being able to work with or collaborate with them.
Yeah, I think I found it really powerful to get involved in different strategies and different tactics for addressing the same issue, to see kind of different sides around. Like, I've been a part of this lawsuit. I've been to like the UN at FCCC conference of the parties, and 24, I think, is the one I went to, and I like spoke with representatives from the federal government. I've also been a part of like some pretty high profile direct actions where I've like locked myself to things to prevent like fossil fuel infrastructure from getting built. You know, I've been to like land back projects and like indigenous reoccupations where they're like at full odds, like the cops are the enemies. If the cops come, they like dig up the roads, burning cop cars. Like, I've seen this whole spectrum of different ways people are coming at this issue. And some of our lawyers have gotten involved in even like our latest legal strategy. I can't say everything about it, but we've been kind of looking into more conservative legal frameworks and how to explain climate change in the context of conservative legal frame, in the context of like originalism, and like in constitutional law, originalism is the is generally like a sort of a legal framework where you look for kind of like oftentimes an essentialist, but at best like just like what was the Constitution as it was written, and like is that how would you interpret it as it was written, like rather than like looking at it in modern context. So it's often a perspective that leans conservative, but there are little things in the Constitution that could really could be taken in support of like a comprehensive climate change policy. So I think kind of like when you're working on an issue, like trying to find like what are the different ways people are addressing them, and maybe like social butterfly around a little bit. For me, like I find it easier to talk with a broader spectrum of people, because if some people disagree with a certain tactic I've been a part of, I can talk about a different tactic.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. I'm just going to check to see if there are any questions that folks, I don't think anybody has put any questions in the chat. But does anybody in our audience have any questions for either or both of our panelists? And you can put them in the chat, or you can just unmute and ask your question. All right. There are no questions. This is a workshop, so we are going to I'll give you something to do and something to discuss. And I know some of you are going to be like, no, I'm just listening to this while I'm doing other things. But we really do hope that you're going to spend the time over the next 15 minutes or so to discuss the scenarios that we have come up with. So what I'm going to do is we're going to put you into two groups. Each group will get a scenario. I'm going to put them on the screen in a moment. After I put you in the groups. So one thing you can do is once the scenario is on the screen, if you want to take a picture of it, you can. After I put you into your groups, I will also drop the scenarios into the chats for your individual groups. And we're just going to give you about 15 minutes or so to kind of discuss the scenarios. So while I arrange all of that, here are the scenarios that you're going to be potentially considering. I know it's a lot of details on this, but we have one focused on safe parking, and we have another focused on hacker paths. And our goal is to have you think from the various perspectives on these and to have a conversation. You can choose any of the questions that we have on there for you to discuss. All right, so I'm going to give you all a moment to read it, although you may not know which scenario you have, and then I'm going to open your groups. So please don't leave this conversation. We ask you to engage in it, all right? And then at the end of it, we're going to ask you to share. Each group is going to share out what they talked about, what were some of the challenges, etc. Okay, so I'm going to put you all into your small groups, but just take a moment to read through this. Yeah, people. All right. Exactly. Okay. Yeah, that's gonna happen. Oh yeah, who you all can see it? Of course you can. Mine, Jan, let's see. I'll just stare at it. Like, oh, there he goes. Oh, okay, or if that happens. I'm going to join the groups and then put them in the chat. Giving people aren't really feeling this. It could be with such a small amount of people, a little bit awkward. Maybe that's why. Yeah. So that, oh, that is still on. Okay, so are there any like stop the sweeps type groups in Belgium? Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Do you kind of interact with them? Like,
Yeah, for sure. In part because they're I mean, like at times during the pandemic, they were like, oh, let's get masks for everyone. Let's make sure that we have these resources available. So again, I kind of end up in this intersection where like nobody's ever 100% happy with me, but also like I'm not totally like in those like in good positions.
yeah.
Work with folks is very different, and I help out with police department, right? So like I have a direct line to the people who are on the streets who they're trying to stop from being swept, right?
Right.
So I'm able to kind of facilitate that connection.
Yeah.
But yeah, you know, and even just like and of course there's that sort of throughout the community. Yeah, I kind of it's a difficult position to be in because it's hard to sort of navigate all of that, but at the same time I do get
Yeah, so yeah, I've had like friends involved in groups like that when I lived in Seattle. I even went to some like protests
Welcome back. Welcome back. So we wanted to see, so I think all of you ended up in the Thacker Pass group, and we have the scenario up there. I wanted to get a sense of what you all talked about. Which of these questions did you choose to tackle? Please unmute. Our folks there.
Yeah, I'm just gonna throw myself into this one. The thing to me with this scenario is that there's not enough information to really, I think, make a really, really good decision.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that there's a few other things that we would have to know before me personally, I'll just talk for myself, before I was able to really construct a really good debate argument or rationale as to why I would go one way or the other, or why I would persuade one way or the other. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Was there a particular part of the question that prompted a thought of like, oh, maybe I hadn't thought of that we would need to think about the issue from this angle, or what might be some more information that you think you would need to know to be able to actually engage with us?
Environmental effects of the mine. That would be one. Whether or not the indigenous folks would benefit at all from the mining at all, whether it be shared profits. That'd be the first two things that come to my mind. It's because basically it's a sort of thing where a few things have to fall into place before you can even have a conversation. And I think that before you have a conversation, you have to establish like who's going to get out of it, like when and why and what, long-term effects, not just can I go in and with some bulldozers and, dig up some lithium, you have to like figure out long-term stuff as opposed to just short-term stuff. That's like the one thing I would say.
All right, long-term versus short-term. So Heather put in the chat, and sorry, the way the chat is, only I can read it. Studies have been done around the long-term effects of mining outfits in a specific lithium mine. Thank you, Heather. So we do have access to that information. We would just need to, actually look at it for it. Any thoughts, Miriam, as to what Michael was saying, or any responses to his comments?
Yeah, I mean, and I have been less engaged in this particular situation, but I have been involved in similar situations. And what often happens when you talk about indigenous groups is we talk about it like it's monolith, but they're obviously not, just like none of us are a monolith. And so there's oftentimes members of tribes who might be interested in working for the company, or might have the possibility of doing that, or might see some economic value to it, who might even agree with it. And then there'll be other people also in the tribes who don't.
Right. Very good point.
Like there is an active campaign against this mining project by a couple of different tribes. And so there's certainly indigenous people who do not see the benefits as worth it. But in this particular situation, I'm not sure if there would be really any local benefits, because the way industry and extractive industry is right now, it's like pretty centralized, and like chances are they would like take out, they would be able, and like mechanized. So like chances are they'd be able to do the mining with big machinery and very few people, and then they would ship it away. So I think in general, there's a very low likelihood of the economic benefit in the local community.
Right.
And then let me see, you said some other thing. There was a few other points you had.
Long-term environmental effects of mining.
Right.
Which Heather responded to. There are definitely, I think that we need to be doing that research to know. I go back to kind of the point that was made about the importance of humanizing. And it can be really tricky to humanize in a way that doesn't create a monolith, or to humanize beyond the monolith. I don't know what the right tactic is there, where it's like, because like I think back to, was it the 80s or the 90s that had the public service, the PSAs about not littering, where someone would throw a piece of trash out of a car and then it'd like pan over to a very stereotypical Native American person crying, and how that was. I can see some folks being like, oh, the memories of that. And like, that is humanizing, but is that humanizing in the right way?
Right, or tokenizing.
Right, or tokenizing. And I don't know if, like, I think this was a really interesting scenario for us to have to think through, because it is like, I've definitely talked to climate change people, people who are like the policy wonks or the science wonks, who are like, no, we need to do, we need to promote this technology or do this or this or this. And they're often surprised by the pushback that they get from people that they think are on their side.
Right. Like
with
nuclear,
it.
they want to have
Yes. Yeah. Any other thoughts about the Thacker Pass? Heather, Jennifer, Michael, or folks in the room? It's up here. We've been staring at it for a little while now. Pressure. Yeah. We also we didn't really have anybody working on the safe parking one, but this scenario is in particular they're both very contemporary topics. The safe parking is a lot more, I think, local, but it's also, and I'm speaking for you, Nico, this is a local conversation that's happening everywhere. And I wanted to see, oh, someone put something in. Heather, thank you. You put some stuff about mining. Sorry, so let me see if I can share this out to everybody, so you all see it. There we go. So paste mining to reduce the impact of, yeah, that's useful. Thank you. Heather, when you say what has been planned for safety in the future, are you talking about the mining question, or are you talking about the safe parking question?
I'm sorry, I was talking about the mining still. I'm sorry, I can't go quite as fast. You know, the impact of when they're done too. Oftentimes when businesses do projects, they aren't ever addressing what's going to happen afterwards and the impact of what they leave behind, and there's no plan for that. It's like, just here, do the job and gone, but there's no plan for what happens afterwards. And there is historical for that too.
Yeah. Thank you, Heather. And thank you for looking up and sharing the article. That's great. Everybody will have access to that. Nico, I'd love to hear your thoughts about the safe parking. What have been some of the challenges as you all are thinking through the conversations that you have to have around it?
Yeah, so, well, and I think I want to try and tie together both of these a little bit, which is to say, like, as I'm sort of listening to the conversation about Thacker Pass, and which is something that I'm less well versed in, well, environmental policy, I'm hearing that there are so many different things that one could prioritize in sort of making a decision or having a particular position with regard. And for me, it's very hard to sort of pull all those threads together. And when I think about policy, and especially about communicating policy, like in public, it always seems to me like the best and most persuasive thing to do is like tell a very simple story. And it's hard to know how to do that in a situation that I'm not well versed in. And like it's very, complex. It has a lot of different priorities that it could select from. When it comes to safe parking, that's what I've tried to do, is try to sort of like thin out the threads and like just sort of recognize what the simplest story that we can tell that it seems true and seems relatable to people is. while also when encountering a sort of differing viewpoint, being willing to hear their story and then try and simplify it to the point where I can understand them as well, and just being able to sort of weigh those competing priorities. It's hard because there's a sort of dance that one has to do of sort of like understanding perspectives, simplifying them, but then sort of like making the situation more complex again by then weaving all these sort of intersecting or competing narratives. You see kind of like you sort of expand out and then you kind of like condense back in. And I think that's what we're doing with safe parking. Look at this like very simple, people are sleeping in their cars and we need somewhere to stay. That's an emergency. Let's do something about it. Start a safe parking program. And then once we sort of open that up, open that line of thinking up for business, then we allow it to become more complex again. I don't want it next to my business because like people are going to break in and do whatever. Put graffiti on the walls. Sleep in front of my open door. Leave needles in nearby areas. I don't want us dedicating money to homelessness when there are so many other priorities that I think are more important. And so then you kind of breathe back out and sort of expand to incorporate all these threads, hear them, and then try to understand the sort of core of their concern, and then speak to them about what they're talking about in a way that can help them to understand why you have the priority that you have. So I think that's what we try to do, and that's what we're trying to do in sort of any circumstance where we're navigating conflict or trying to break through polarization. Simplify, understand the complexity, simplify again, and just work our way towards a shared understanding.
I appreciate that. I also think in any scenario, it can be easy to villainize people that seem to be pushing against us. I think that's this idea that, okay, well, business owners, they clearly don't want to support our unhoused population. They clearly want to earn profits, and every single person who works for a business, right, is in on it, right? That sort of thing. And it can be so easy for us to just write them off as, well, they're never going to be for us, and really work towards that us versus them sort of thing. And so like one of the things that we have as we have conversation norms, and one of our conversation norms is listen for shared values, right? Thinking about what's underneath the politicized spin and really try to get to what it is that we actually share. But we're all going to view, like I've had this conversation, and I know we're almost at time, but I've had this conversation around community safety and policing, where there are folks that say, well, the police are what creates safety for us. And others are like, no, the police make it far less safe for us. But remembering that both sides value safety, it's just that we have all these extra layers on top of it. And what does it take to get back down to that shared value to be able to actually have that conversation without canceling each other, perhaps? So I'm going to stop my share. Hey, thank you to all of you who attended and stuck with us to the very end. We really appreciate it. Thanks for attending this session. Thank you so much to our two guests, Nico and Miriam, for coming and spending time with us, sharing about the work that they're doing and the important and challenging conversations that they had. Clearly, we have solved it all at this stage. If you, actually, no, I covered all the stuff I need to cover. Tomorrow, this wraps up our second day of Voices United. Please feel free to, please do join us. Tomorrow we have a few different sessions, including a keynote with Washington Secretary of State, Steve Hobbs, and a more kind of informal conversation with him around depolarizing, depolarizing a little bit, but how misinformation affects elections and how we work on using dialogue. And then on Thursday, we really have an exciting day, a bunch of sessions with a guy named Manu, who's gonna come and talk about his work across the country around creating student-led movements on campuses around depolarizing and democratic dialogue. Thank you again so much. We hope that you'll be able to join. Yeah, and Heather, thank you for putting that. And again, thank you to our two guests. Have a wonderful day.